Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kateri Joe. I am Swinomish and Kalelt. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Tribal Engagement Manager at Treehouse.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shoshaunee Perez. I am a descendant of the Tulalip and Tlingit peoples. On my mother's side, I work for Northwest Indian College as the first-year experience and passport advisor. It is great to see all of you guys here.
Sorry, I have two screens going, so I'm doing everything I can not to focus on one because it's bigger than the other, but I realize that the camera is right here. So for today, we're going to go over just like three main objectives. An hour is kind of a hard amount of, like a small amount of time to get all the information that we possibly could get in understanding how to work with tribal communities. So we're just kind of focusing on three main categories. Our objectives today are understanding sovereignty, historical trauma and how it can present in our students, and just enrollment. So just things that we need to know. All right, we're going to get started. So understanding sovereignty. The sovereignty status, tribal sovereignty, encompassing Native American military, social, and economic development of Indian nations still remains today. As sovereign entities, Indian nations are guaranteed the power and the right to determine their form of government, define citizenship, make and enforce laws through their own police force and courts, collect taxes and regulate properties. Yet the fight to preserve tribal sovereignty and treaty rights has long been the forefront of the Native American civil rights struggle. So we understand what sovereignty is. Well, in theory, we understand what sovereignty is, but a lot of times we don't really understand what it means like in action. One way in which sovereignty shows up currently is during the pandemic. So if you look on the far left, this is still Squamish. So back when a lot of our tribal nations shut down, they kind of had different tactics of ways in which they decided for themselves that they wanted to reopen. And still Squamish, Angel of the Winds, they opened back in March. They opened back in March because they had the ability to do so. They determined what was appropriate for their people. They were able to determine how they were able to reopen safely and what fit them the best. In the middle, you have, this is a checkpoint over in Oklahoma. Sorry, my dog is like freaking out behind me because I live where there's like a window and people are walking by. I'm trying really hard to keep her quiet. And over in Lakota territories, this is a checkpoint. So whenever somebody was coming into their territories, they wanted to make sure they knew who was coming in, where they were going, and information. So that way they were able to do contact tracing, which has allowed them to keep their numbers down a lot lower. And on far right, you have Makah Nation, and Makah had actually closed down their borders from everyone who is a non-tribal member and does not live in Neah Bay or Makah territories. And so this just shows how in different parts of different tribal nations, they all have the ability to choose for themselves and for their communities and for their people what makes the most sense for them, and to be able to enforce that.
Kateri, if I can give another example as well. So I live in Bellingham, Washington, so I work closely with the Lummi Nation. And so a really good example of also what Kateri is talking about with sovereignty. So although the state has its whole reopening plan, its whole phase plan, Lummi Nation itself has practiced its sovereignty and created its own phased reopening plan as well. And so while they are not practicing these things, like Kateri is showing where they necessarily have closed the reservation and things such as that off, they have the full law and capacity to decide how things are running. So for instance, the stay-at-home order, even though that was taken off by Governor Inslee months ago, it is actually still in effect until the end of November within the Lummi Nation, because they are practicing their sovereign right to protect their lands and to protect their people.
Mm-hmm. Another real life example is over in Nova Scotia, up in Canada. There's currently having like a sovereignty battle over the fishing rights for that community to go lobster fishing outside of the commercial fishing openings. And that is their sovereign rights to do fishing and to do it so a lot of time, anytime that they want, essentially, because those are treaty rights. But the fishing community, or the commercial fishing community, has been really violent towards them, has burned down their, I think they're called like lobster pounds, where they kind of hold all of their harvest. Um, and they are really in need of support for those salmon rights right now. And I'm going to give it over to Shoshaunee.
Thank you, Terry. So one of the big topics that we wanted to talk about, and to be very honest, this is a very large topic that we can't necessarily cover everything all in whole, is historical trauma. So historical trauma is comprised of many different things in terms of the definition. And the most basic definition that I think Kateri and I could come up with to give to you definitely has to do with boarding schools and other things along those lines. It has to do with the injustices and the inequities that have happened to tribal people. And you can also look at historical trauma in people of any minority culture as well, but it is very much a prevalent term within the Native community. And so the way that we wanted to break it down historical trauma was to give examples and to show you kind of where it falls within these 4 different aspects before we talk about the educational sector. So first off, you can see historical trauma individually. People may experience a loss of self-identity. So the best example that I can kind of give into this is self-identity will oftentimes come from when you look at the boarding school area, being removed from their home, comes into not being able to relate to the people that they're from. So for example, for myself, the best example I can give is my great grandmother, my Kaya. So we experienced a loss of self-identity because she is actually Duwamish by birth. And so she actually had to choose after the whole Reconstruction era and putting people onto reservations, whether or not she wanted to be Duwamish and not have anything, or if she wanted to be Tulalip and actually have some sort of right. So she was losing her self-identity from her original peoples and her original hunting grounds and all of those things. You can also see low self-esteem and a lack of sense of personal safety. They may also struggle to build healthy relationships. They can also become institutionalized, replacing traditional cultural behaviors with those embedded in boarding schools, similar to those who've been incarcerated for long periods of time. So think about the historical trauma that also happens with incarceration. So we know that historically and through data that minorities, particularly Native American and African American, are the highest numbers of those that are currently incarcerated. And so you may see a lot of the historical trauma behaviors also manifest with those that have been incarcerated, where they lose their sense of identity. They don't have a lot of their traditional practices and those things.
I also just wanted to add a little bit to the lack of self-identity too. Like another aspect to think of it is if your identity has been shown through your worldview. So the way in which you show up in the world, the little nuances that you understand in certain spaces, like knowing in tribal communities that, you know, elders, like our elders are really highly revered, and the ways in which you just know how to show up in each space, but then being forcibly to change your worldview to like this Western ideal, you no longer are really sure where you fit in, because now your way in which you're taught to show up doesn't fit into tribal spaces as the same way it did before. And the same way, you understand that your physical appearance doesn't fully connect in like Western society too. So you have like this dualistic, it's sometimes called like walking in 2 worlds, where you have to live half your life in Western sense, half your life in Indigenous sense, but still like maintaining your personal self. And it's something that, you know, as young folk, it's hard to understand your personal identity in general, but then also having to consistently code switch how confusing that can become, and where you're and how you're supposed to show up in every new space that you present.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning it, Kateri. Yes, we're often, especially in the educational world, it is often talked about walking into worlds and how do you do that on an individual level so that you are, I don't want to, that you are employable. For a lot of people, that's kind of the way that they look at it. So on the familial level, for families that were forced to send their children to boarding schools. And so in this era, we are looking probably for Kateri and I more along our grandparents and possibly some of our aunties, or Kateri's might be closer than mine.
Yeah, I'm a little bit older, but it's actually my parents' age?
So for me, some of my great aunties and my great grandparents along in that area were those that were forced to send their children to boarding schools. They can feel a lack of parental power. They were unable to instill their own cultural values through traditional child rearing practices. Once families were reunited, natural family ties are negatively impacted and can affect their interaction. And a lot of this has to do, going back again, to the things that were instilled and forced upon them within the boarding schools. So they were taught that their family was not their family, and that the people that were within the boarding schools were those that were teaching them and becoming their new family that they needed to follow. So once you kind of break that tie of your mom is not your mom or your parent is not your parent, and what they tell you doesn't go anymore, but I'm your parent and this is what you need to follow, you kind of negatively impact that tie even if you were to bring them back to their family, which is ultimately what the goal was. Um, for survivors of boarding schools, their experience of child rearing is from an abusive school staff, so just like we were talking about. This can make it difficult to have healthy child rearing practices when they become parents, because one of my professors for many years also used to tell me all the time, we teach what we know. And so what is happening, or what we would see, was that the historical trauma was these parents were teaching what they knew, which was not the traditional child rearing practices and the love that they were given before they were taken to boarding school, but what happened to them while they were in boarding school. And so we're, just like George was talking about this morning, perpetuating that cycle. And so it has taken many years, and it is still taking many years, to break that cycle of healthy child rearing or negative child rearing practices and bring back those traditional healthy child rearing practices.
I think like another way to compare the difference between like Western and Indigenous like child rearing practices too is just the idea of like the extended family. One way to like really see how that is impacted even by our language is your sokwa is like your younger sibling, but that doesn't but they also equate like cousins as the same thing. Like there's no differentiation between a cousin and a sibling. They are just sokwa. Their ska is like there is your older sibling. That can also be your cousins too. And the idea of like grandmas or your kayas, they are your grandparents or your grandma, your grandpa, or your grandma, but it's also all of their siblings too. So it's almost more like a generation or a level versus specific understanding of like this person is this one linear kind of family tree and only this one person can tell me what to do. The one way how I think about it is like the way in which like personally like my family has like a more indigenous kind of child rearing practice is whenever my cousin or like whenever my nephews or my nieces come over, um, any one of any one of the adults are able um, to like have to discipline the kids, understanding that it was done out of love and it's done out of growth and it's done because we care and we want to make sure all of the kids in our life, not just our own biological kids, are doing right. Um, so for like example, one thing I can think of is I was my nephew had been throwing something, just acting kind of wild, and so I put him on timeout. And my sister, his mom, came back in and was like, what's happening? And my nephew asked my sister, like, TT put me on timeout. Can I come out? And then she goes, no, if TT put you on timeout, that means TT is the one that let you off. So just like how different that kind of experience would be in other cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, and I like to think about that too, kind of from another cultural perspective. So I was born and raised to be more of what we consider an urban Indian. I was raised in the city. However, when I moved up to Bellingham, I created a surrogate family, is what you would call it in the Western world, but I call lots of people mom and auntie that are not my biological family. And so that was traditional practice as well, because it was very much the belief and understanding that the village raised the family, the tribe raised the family. And so just like Kateri was talking about, those different status structures. So no matter who the elder was, that the elder, if you were at a ceremony and the elder told you to do something, you were to do that. You were not to question that. And then you were also, it's very often that our generation or the generation that you were in was also to know that you were the example for the younger generation. So it was also a very fluid sort of structure. And so when you're looking at boarding schools and the historical trauma that happened, it was very, we look at family trees and we look at things in a very, very linear sense, which is not necessarily the case traditionally. So for tribal communities, most indigenous histories and practices are passed down from oral history and or direct interaction with knowledge keepers. So traditionally, things were never written down, and when you were very lucky to be in the presence of a knowledge keeper and for them to pass down that knowledge to you. It wasn't just willy-nilly given to you. You had to have a reason for that, and there was a traditional reason for that. A generation was taken and Western practices were embedded. So we're talking about when children were taken to the boarding schools. Many tribal communities lost their language, traditional practices, ceremonies, traditional dress, and sense of community living. And so these children that were taken away, they were taught that their traditional beings, their dress, their voice, all of these things were not correct, and they needed to learn to speak English and dress like an English person, which who knows how you do that now, because we all have so many totally different forms of fashion, but that was what the belief was. And so these children oftentimes were beaten and things to forget these. And so because our traditions and our languages are all oral, when you take away an entire sector of people, an entire generation, multiple generations, in fact, of people, those are lost. And so the reason that we're seeing kind of a revitalization of languages and tradition is actually coming back because we are trying to work a lot of times with our knowledge keepers that are still alive, thankfully, that are able to instill all of this information in us as well. The kind of weird upside of this, I guess, coming from somebody that is an urban native that did not grow up traditionally in my culture, is a lot of things because of anthropologists were written down. And so I have the ability now as a young adult woman who is raising her daughter to be able to teach her my indigenous practices, because I'm able to learn from things that like even my great uncle, who he wrote down our family history. And so thankfully I'm able to learn those sorts of things. So there's kind of an upside to that part of it. But in terms of historical trauma, it is still, there's a lot of times where there's many, many large pieces of family history and language and ceremony that may be missing that we're never going to get back because of this trauma.
I just want to add to like one mantra that that someone told me once that I always think about on a regular basis is all of our ceremonies are one generation from death, right? So like just like you're talking about, if you take away one knowledge keeper, then that has the possibility to negatively impact all generations coming from then on too. And that's why I feel like a lot of folks are trying to learn as much as they possibly can, just in the hopes to then be able to pass it on. One story one of my elders was telling me that like really kind of like helped me hold on to this idea was so she was taught some traditional practices that previously were not something that a female would do on a regular basis. It's not like as far as traditional like gender norms, it wasn't something that a female would learn. But her elder was realizing at the time that there was a lot of just a lot of hurt and a lot of trauma and a lot of reasons why the men in her community and her family were not in the right mind to pick up these practices. And so he taught her, even though she didn't want to in the moment, because he said, you're going to have to hold this knowledge for the generation after, because the men aren't ready for it right now. So it's kind of like this almost like not obligation, but like this responsibility that sometimes you have to learn just to hold the knowledge for the generation after you, because it's not something that is readily given. Another example of like kind of different Western and Indigenous view perspectives is the idea that knowledge isn't something like Shoshaunee was saying, that like was just readily given to anybody who wanted it. It's not something that you had the right to expect. It's something that is gifted to you. So I have like this a very specific example. I was at a Canuck up in Alaska, and I was visiting a friend. So it's not my tribe, it's not my village, but I was invited to go there. And so I was watching the dances, and I was just kind of sitting on bleachers behind me. And her father was kind of like telling me about the stories, and it wasn't something I asked him for. It was something that he offered to me, and he was telling me about the story of like what was happening in the song and what was happening and like where the songs came from. And I was like really excited to learn about it, but it wasn't something I asked him. There are two women that were non-native that were sitting behind me, and they were like listening in and like asking questions. And I just remember thinking like how completely different those perspectives were, that I knew that if someone wanted to offer me information, they would give it to me. And this idea that the two women behind me expected that they learn everything that they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to speak, if we're talking in practitioner terms, what I often like to think about in terms of this and historical trauma, and the way Kateri is talking with the information that's given and the information that's readily available, is when we're working with our students and the families. We know that our students are not going to potentially offer us, we don't want to pry and say, what is going on in your household, or where are you from, or why were you taken from your family? But eventually that trust and that relationship building, which is extremely important in tribal and Native communities and Indigenous cultures everywhere, it eventually will happen. I promise it will eventually happen when that trust is coming to be built by you along with that family or along with that person. You will eventually be privileged that information. But Kateri is very right. So you may oftentimes it's oftentimes actually said, if you want to know something, you go to your elders. And so that is something that we often find now, especially that we are seeing the traditional knowledge keepers are passing away, unfortunately, because many of them are getting older. And so we are finding that a lot of our youth are going and sitting with the elders and are putting time aside to do that instead of potentially doing things like going to school or being in the workforce. And it's because they're trying to preserve and to protect that culture. A really good example that I have is recently in the Lummi tribal community, their hereditary chief passed away. And so while he was getting ready to go on his journey home, there were many young folk and some adults as well. So I believe we had some young adults that were as old as like 17, 18, up into people that were in their 40s that were spending their last days with the chief to preserve those stories. And so we as an institution recognized that. And so that was something that we could look at for if they were not successful in their classes. They were working on protecting that information and protecting those traditions. So it's extremely important. And then if we look at tribal nations, when there's a breakdown of the tribal community, it then affects the tribe as a nation. This then weakens the structure of the nation. With high rates of tribal members living off reservations, it can affect if they are enrolled members. This depletion of enrollment can affect the power of a nation. And this is very true. The traditional reason, or not the traditional, because it's not tradition. So way back when, so tradition was if you knew who your family was and you were part of a family, you were considered to be part of that family. And this is something we can get into with enrollment. But when it came to the government basically trying to kill the native, which was the whole purpose way back when, was when enrollment was instilled. And so because of that, the historical trauma from that, and I'm a living, breathing example of that historical trauma. I do not qualify by government standards to be part of my community, but by traditional standards, I am part of my community and I do know who my family is. And so that has removed me as part of my community, which is still trauma that I deal with. And it's trauma that unfortunately my daughter is going to have to deal with on actually 3 different fronts, because she has 3 different tribal nations. So that's just something to very much kind of think about when you're working with young Indigenous individuals, as many of these individuals do identify with and are part of a tribal nation, but by government standards, they are not actually part of that tribe or that Indigenous community. I'm ready when you are, Kateri. So I wanted to bring this kind of forefront and kind of give you some examples for trauma and education. I have spent so kind of, I guess, a brief history. So like I said, I was raised as an urban native. I was raised in the Western world. I was given very little information about
my Indigenous culture. And so I have watched, and after coming and moving to Bellingham and being a guest on the reservation of the Lummi Nation for the last 10 years now, I have got to learn many different things about my people, but I've also seen, unfortunately, the way that historical trauma has played out in education. So these are kind of speaking from terms in regards to collegiate standards, but you can also see a lot of this within the K-12 system. And the reason I say that is because the K-12 system, the public school system, is designed from a westernized world. And so it's not necessarily designed for traditional teaching practices. And so traditional teaching practices in education were sitting down and talking. There was no written things, there was no testing, and it was sharing knowledge intergenerationally. And so we at our college oftentimes practice that, especially in a lot of our cultural sovereignty classes. We share knowledge intergenerationally, and things are not necessarily tested. It's just an overall breadth of knowledge and what have you learned and what have you grown to understand from that. But if you are to look in terms of the way that trauma shows up in education, oftentimes we see lower test scores and placements. So that can also have to do with students taking SATs, ACTs. Standardized testing is not a traditional form of learning. And so unfortunately, and I hear this as a practitioner in education quite frequently, is, am I stupid? Because they see a low test score. So this is often something that we see very, very frequently. We don't see high test scores. Which unfortunately, in the way that collegiate systems often work, thankfully for COVID, a lot of those test scores are not required right now, but oftentimes many students would not find themselves being able to attend the institution that they wanted to attend because they were not able to test high enough. And so it creates, just like one of our other bullet points, it creates a sense of lower self-esteem. Many of these students, I hear day in and day out, I don't understand math, I don't understand this doesn't make sense to me, I'm gonna suck at this. All of these terminologies and things come up when you are working with a student who has experienced historical trauma. A lot of our students have a very strong fear of leaving their reservation for higher education because the lands that they are on are the people that they know, and they don't, because of that historical trauma and the stories that they hear from boarding schools and being removed and being taken away, is oftentimes, even though, and this is the strange thing with historical trauma, even though these young adults will never have to experience that, thankfully, it's almost as if they live the lives that their ancestors lived. So they have those same feelings when it comes to, I have to leave my reservation to go to school, to get an education. I don't want to leave the people that I know, the community that I trust. And so oftentimes they will either stay and work and become a part of the working community and then save school for later, or ultimately they may never go to school in general because that fear is just so deeply embedded. And I kind of want to press this a lot, is that they oftentimes don't know why they have that fear. They know it's there, they feel it, but they can't articulate to you what we are articulating in regards to, this is historical, it's coming from their family, and it is actually very physically embedded in their DNA. They also have difficulty. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that too. I think something that is also can also be like a really big difference too, is for a lot of our youth that are coming from reservations, especially like tribal schools, and then going to a non-tribal college, just the ways in which things are run is very, very different. For example, when I was at Muckleshoot Tribal School, when I was working there, if I asked the front desk folk about a student, they could tell me their entire family. They could tell me who in the school is connected to them. They could tell me what was happening in their life, that was happening in their family's lives, in ways in which it will impact that student. And if they go to, a big college with prior knowing like who everyone is and who everyone's family is, and then all of a sudden being one of thousands of kids who also, if you're coming from a tribal school or you're one of many Indigenous kids in a school where a lot of the students look like you, they have a similar background, similar like lived experience, and then you go to a Western institution and nobody looks like you. None of your instructors look like you. My very first time ever having an instructor, I also grew up urban, having an instructor that was Indigenous was my sophomore year of college, and that was only because I was taking Native American Indigenous Studies. None of my other professors in any of my other programs were Indigenous. The first time I actually had an Indigenous professor that was teaching something to all, to like not a Native specific program or not a Native specific class wasn't until my master's program. So you can see how when you like look around and you see that no one looks like you and no one understands your lived experience, how you can start to feel like I don't belong here. And you also can I mean, I've also heard it too, that where kids will go, they'll try it out and then just realize that like loss of community is so hard for them to bear that they end up going home after a year, because it's so hard to go from having this really strong sense of community and being one of many to being one of almost no population. And so if you're unable to find your community in your new place, then your success is going to be very, very challenging.
Yes, totally. And I came upon a lot of this knowledge and understanding because I did a capstone on how to bring Native tribal people into college. And so a lot of this is something that comes up just by practice, but also, so one of the biggest things that I can give you as a tip is if you are working with an Indigenous person, is to bring their family into the fold. They are going to have a much higher success rate, and they are going to feel more comfortable if their family is brought into the fold, if you include their family in conversations. It's also hard to break those ties a lot too. I often have to have conversations when we're talking about what a student wants to do. I often have to try to break the tie a little bit because they will often say, well, my family wants me to. And well, traditionally that is correct. We also want to give our students a sense of autonomy and have them work and think in their own brains to understand, again, that walking into worlds, that they can be their own selves and they can be able to gain and grow and bring back this education and this understanding back to their communities and do so much good. Which is why part of, I say, bringing in the family is really good, because they also have a difficulty navigating a new system. So oftentimes when you're working with any sort of minority, but Indigenous minorities, they don't understand. Oftentimes 90% of them are first generation students, even in the generations that we're looking at now. Which means they don't understand what a FAFSA is. They don't understand how to do an admissions application. They don't even oftentimes understand how to study for a standardized test. So they have a very strong difficulty, which then recreates that fear. And oftentimes they want to leave that system. So being able to walk beside them and say, this is a learning process for both of us, and we're going to learn together, will help that student be successful. They also have a very strong fear to ask for assistance or enroll in supportive services. And this goes back to not even just their collegiate sense, but goes back to their K-12 system. And it is, I will tell you from experience, the number of times that I've heard students say, my teachers have told me I'm stupid, that I'm enrolled in the lowest level classes I can be in, that I have an IEP, I won't graduate from high school until I'm 21. All of these things, these students hear during the K-12 system because they don't have a great support system. Unfortunately, teachers that believe in them and support them, sticks with them, and they continue to believe that when they move into a higher education system. And so oftentimes as an advisor, when I'm finding that we're doing check-ins with our students and we're finding that they're not being successful, and they say, well, I don't understand these things. I say, well, have you visited the tutoring center? Have you asked our Trio staff? Have you talked with your instructor? Or asked the question in class? They all tell me no, because I don't want to look stupid. And when you're hearing that as an outsider for the first time, you go, why would you think you're stupid? Everybody has a question. I was taught everybody has a question, and 9 times out of 10, somebody in that classroom also has the same question that you do. They're just as afraid to ask as you are. But these students very much believe that if they don't pretend, because they feel they have imposter syndrome, they feel that they don't already fit in, that if they raise their hand, then they're showing their true colors and saying, I don't belong here. I don't fit in here. And then, like Kateri is talking about, they will eventually then turn around and go home. And it takes them decades to come back. I have students that are like, I was here in 1999 and I'm just not ready to come back because of an experience that I had, or I didn't feel smart. And that experience that they had back in 1999 is still sticking with them in 2020. And so it's kind of hard because it's almost as us to be as practitioners to kind of almost be intuitive, but just be able to ask those questions and sometimes ask them to repeat information back because it's an oral, their brain works better in an oral fashion instead of something written down. So can you tell me what I just said to you? Do you have questions? And just constantly practice. And again, it's creating that trust with that student or with that Indigenous individual so that they are going to be able to bypass that trauma and be successful.
I also wanted to add to like another reason why a lot of our youth are afraid to ask for assistance. It stems also from the trauma um, of our people being disproportionately impacted by the foster care system and just all different types of institutions in general. So if you have this fear that you're not getting the requirements that you need, your basic necessities being met, that was something a lot of our families were taught to keep to keep at home, because there's that fear that if you're unable to get your basic needs met, then social workers are going to come and take you. And this has everything to do with the scoop era. It has everything to do with boarding schools. It has everything to do with just the ways in which systems have been designed to negatively impact our people of color, specifically in this instance of our Indigenous people too.
Yeah, and the other kind of form, I like that Kateri brought that up because I honestly didn't think about that to begin with as well, is we often talk about, where Kateri is talking about not having basic necessities met. And so that is another form of trauma that our students are still experiencing. And the one thing that we always say at our college and in our office is you can't learn with an empty tummy. And so oftentimes many of these students are going without a safe place to live, are going without food in their bellies or nutrition in their bodies. And so this is a trauma that they're still living because they already have feel like they're not being met or taken care of in home. And so their fear is that they're not going to be ready for or being met or have the same experience that a student in a traditional white dominated college will have. And so there's a lot of intricacies that we all obviously know being practitioners to be aware of and to think about when we are working with these Indigenous individuals who we all want to set up for success. And to show them that for once in their life, somebody believes in them and that they can overcome and break that cycle of trauma and start again. Kateri, you're muted.
Whoops. So we're being really intentional because we are very aware of how much time that we have, and Shoshaunee and I are really passionate about the subject, and so we can talk forever. So this is our last slide as far as understanding, because this is like the most common question I always get from practitioners is, how do I know if my youth is enrolled? And the quick answer to pretty much anything Indigenous is it depends on the tribe. There's no one fit answer for anything for all tribes everywhere, because there's over 550 tribes throughout the United States, not even including First Nations in Canada. So there's absolutely no way, and the diversity is so huge. It's like more diverse than the countries in Europe. So there's absolutely just no way that you can ever give like a one size fits all answer, except for it depends on the tribe. So this is the 4 ways that are most commonly used for tribal enrollment, but each tribe has the ability to choose for themselves what they deem as requirements to become an enrolled member. And that has everything to do with their sovereignty. So what is an enrolled member? An enrolled member is that they have met all their eligibility requirements of their tribe and have access to all tribal benefits. That means oftentimes that they have a status card or a tribal card, which, funny enough, we are the only ethnicity that has to prove our identity, that have to have a card to prove it. And it's almost the exact like influx of like being African American or Black, where like for African American or Black, you have like the like one drop rule. We're absolutely in reverse, where you have to have so much native blood in order to prove that you're a native. So it's like this kind of weird influx that it's completely opposite paradigms. So what is so lineage is kind of what Shoshaunee was talking about, is like being able to trace your bloodline from who you are, who your parents are, who your grandparents are, all the way back to the original census. Now we think about the original census as being back in like however long ago, 1400s, 1700s, but a lot of our tribal nations were actually, our original census, especially in the Pacific Northwest, was like around the 1800s, some even in the 1900s. And so it might not be as far back as we think, right? But you still have to be able to prove that you come from the bloodline of somebody who was on the original census. And also another weird thing too about the Pacific Northwest specifically is almost every single one of our tribes, whether they are called confederated or not, are confederated tribes. We had villages that came that were forcibly impacted, like put together, removed, put to wherever it is that their tribal or that their treaty rights told them that they were going to be living. One other really interesting fact is like the treaty of, I forgot that, it's in Medicine Creek. It's the one down in by Olympia. I think so. So most of the other treaties in Washington state were able to come to an agreement within like a day. But the treaty, and I believe it's Medicine Creek, don't quote me on it, but I know it's the one kind of in like south by Olympia-ish territory. They took several days to do it because the governor at the time was trying to make them sign a treaty, but not tell them where they were going. So it would be equivalent to someone coming to say, we're going to take your house and I'm going to move you somewhere else. And you're thinking, where are you going? Where are we going? I might be okay with it and I might not be okay with it, but where am I going? And he wouldn't tell. And so because of that, it took 3 days for them to come to the agreement that they would sign it. And I mean, thinking back then, we were traditional, hunter and gatherers. So like knowing when, knowing like where your fishing lines were, what time your traditional hunting grounds were, where your traditional like gathering territories were, like these all matter because it was the ability to provide for your family, right? And so the idea of trying to sign a treaty, have no idea if you're even going to be able to make it back to your traditional places of gathering food to provide for your family, like that is a terrifying idea. So a descendant is someone who has a biological parent that is an enrolled member of the tribe. For some of our tribes, having a descendant, though you're not technically an enrolled member, you still have some benefits, I guess, for lack of a better word, or some ways in which you are still connected to your tribe and can partake, but you're not officially an enrolled member. Blood quantum is a system that was used and created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs was originally created as part of the War Department. So that will like make you understand how the US government viewed Indigenous people. It's now moved to I can't remember, like the interior, I don't know. But it was a system used by the BIA to measure the amount of tribe-specific blood a person has. So look, the way in which you think of it is every time is being halved, right? So if you have a full Native tribal person, the full Native American from one specific tribe who is considered 100%, if they have a partner that is non-Native or who just is not of that tribe, they can be full Native, but not of that tribe. They have a child. That child would be then considered half and half. So it can be considered half. If that child then had another child and they didn't have blood lineage or they didn't have blood from the same tribe, then they are now a quarter. So for a lot of our tribes, the most common requirement is a quarter of a specific tribe plus all the other whatever enrollment requirements that the tribe has in order to be enrolled. But one thing to think about is our tribes, especially in the Pacific Northwest, are very small. I think my tribe is around 1,000, maybe 1,200. I don't really know. we're small, right? And so having to find somebody who's your tribe, who's not your cousin, um, which is always the first question you're going to ask is like, who are you? Who's your family? And then you try and think of in your head, like, how many generations away are we from each other? um, that is a really hard thing to do, to find someone of your tribe and to have someone that you care about of your tribe. And so our blood lineage is our blood, the blood quantum is really hard. So a lot of times you'll have somebody who might have 100% Native American blood, but have so many different tribes that they don't have the ability to enroll in any one specific one because it's hard to meet all those requirements in a partner, right?
And I kind of want to piggyback off of that. So when we talk about the blood quantum system and the BIA, I want to reiterate where that falls into historical trauma. That was the United States government's way of completely obliterating and getting rid of the Native Americans. And so it is, just like Kateri is talking about, it is still one of the systematic ways that to this day that the United States is trying to still eradicate and get rid of the tribal peoples. Because like a perfect example, like Kateri was talking about. So I fall under the descendant system because my mother is an enrolled member. And so in order for me to be part of my tribal community, to become an enrolled member, I would have to live on my reservation for no less than a year. And not only that, but then I'd also have to prove my lineage too. So I have a two-folded system in terms of being enrolled in Tulalip. And so for me, I'm not allowed to practice. I'm not allowed to vote or any of things within my sovereign rights. But in terms of the blood quantum system, because my grandmother married a white man, my great grandmother had children by a white man, I actually would not even qualify through the BIA as somebody that is traditionally tribal, because I don't even meet the quarter system. And so unfortunately, the conversations, and I hate having these conversations that my husband and I are having, is my daughter will not be able to access any of her tribal rights because my husband is considered a quarter. He's Blackfoot and he's a quarter Blackfoot, but that makes my daughter an eighth from me, and it doesn't even qualify her enough to be enrolled in any tribe. And so that's part of her ethnicity and her identity that she's going to be missing, only in the sense that she won't qualify as that, but I, as her mother, will be able to teach her the information that I know and the stories that I know that can help her be part of that ethnicity and part of that identity, aside from the system that is trying to eradicate Native people.
Thank you for that addition. And the last most common thing is called the regional citizenship. So the idea they have to live within a geographical region of the tribe that has been determined. And one thing to remember is, especially in Pacific Northwest, is our reservations are very small. And so being able to have housing for all of our tribal members is non-realistic, especially on reservations. And so oftentimes you'll have like families that are doubling up, sometimes tripling up, because there's just no housing for everybody who wants to live in reservations, to have an ability to get there. An example is my sister and my tribe goes by kind of like a need / amount of people kind of system on when you get housing. My sister applied for housing with her son when she first moved back home from Arizona, which is 8 years ago. And she still hasn't been getting the call to get housing for my tribe. And so for my tribe, I actually have a threefold system. So for my tribe, you have to prove lineage, you have to have a quarter blood, and you also have to have regional citizenship. So what that means is I have 11 nephews and 2 nieces, big family, where I have 2 of my siblings that have children live in Seattle, and 2 of my siblings that have children live on reservation. So for my siblings that have kids on reservations, when they were born, because one was born on res, he was able to be automatically enrolled because he fit all the requirements. And then my other sister, who moved from Hawaii back to Swinomish, we then had to go through an adoption process. And so the adoption process is when you have to prove lineage, prove descendancy, prove lineage, prove blood quantum. You have to then get a tribal member who is of voting age to then sponsor you, to stand us up during general council and then say who your family is, why you want to become enrolled, and then general council, so all the folks who are enrolled members over the age of 18 then can vote on whether or not they want to allow you into the tribe. So the very first time, that sister that came home has 5 kids. 2 were enrolled and 3 were not. So even within the same family, you had 3 enrolled, 2 were not. The next year they did it again, and then all of them are enrolled. But I don't have any kids, but if I did have children, I would have to move back home, have to find a place to live, because I'd have to live with one of my siblings, because there is no housing. Because of my sister who has a son hasn't gotten housing in 8 years, there's no way me as a single person is going to be able to go up there and find housing. And then have my child on reservation in order for them to be automatically enrolled. And so these are all requirements that are tribally determined, but still, because there can be like a Western viewpoint of like trying to make sure that someone is native enough, can make it really, really challenging to accept outsiders, right? Someone who might be of indigenous blood or of your community's blood, but you might view as an outsider because they were not born there, because they were urban. So there's just like so many intricacies that go into tribal communities that it's this hour isn't really enough. So we just went like the most specific things that we've had several questions on. So from here, we wanted to open it up to everyone, to allow you to to ask questions, say comments, comparisons, whatever it is that you find interesting. If you could either raise your hand, or if you have the ability just to like unmute yourself and ask a question.
And we were also going to open it up, and please don't feel like it has to be on these specific topics. Any question that you may have, we would be more than happy to answer. Kateri, do you mind unsharing your screen, because then we can see everybody?
Is that a hand, Patrick?
It is. Yeah, well, first off, thank you both. I really appreciate your insights, and especially your continued work. Work in Indian education is not an easy thing, right? Shoshaunee, you were mentioning earlier this idea of kind of the walking in 2 worlds, and I remember Dan Wildcat, who was my mentor when I was in college, really described that as the schizophrenic worldview. And so something I'm kind of curious about, from your perspectives, is that you've struggled in education with having to deal with the multiplicity of worldview. But now that you find yourself in educational roles, I would argue that there's still challenges when you're looking at, say, like bureaucracies or governance structures or integration with that. So if you could, what have you found that's been most helpful for you as Native educators to continue the work and to do this challenging work to address these wicked problems?
I think it's, unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to go away, because of the systems that govern universities, and overarching things, even such as nonprofits, right? We have bigger overarching Western systems that govern those. But I think what I oftentimes do is I speak oftentimes to high school students, and I just share my story, because the best way that you can break that barrier or you can gain that trust is just by sharing where you came from. And so talking about to young adults, and I've been doing it for the last 6 years, is I talk about how I grew up in a Western world and how I was not privileged to understand who my family was, or my traditions or my language were. and how oftentimes I was considered the token student in the classroom because growing up in a military, I grew up around Fort Lewis, Washington, if many of you know that. So I grew up in Lakewood, Washington. There was myself, my two younger sisters, and I think two or three other students that were Indigenous or identified as Native American when they filled out their paperwork when their parents are filling that out. And so we had, of course, our Native American liaison, and I use that term very loosely because we were not often afforded a lot of time with that person. I don't even remember who the person's name was. And we didn't know who the other Native students were. And so I was oftentimes asked stupid questions like, did you scout people? I was asked that in American US history when I was in middle school, all different kinds of things. And so the very funny story is when we were getting ready to graduate from high school, our counselors came around and said, oh, can you tell us where you're going to college? We want to announce it when you're going to walk across the stage, or we want to post it so that like our, the superintendent's board and all of that can see it. And so I said Northwest Indian College, and they're like, what is that? Like, who is that? Where does that come from? And so I really try and share my experience with students, especially because oftentimes now we are in a place where most of our youth are considered urban natives. They don't live within their reservation. They don't attend their tribal schools. And so I really tried to share my story about where I was, and by taking the time and understanding and going to my elders and being able to have the great experience of going to a tribal college, how that shifted my paradigm and how that shifted the way that I think, and how it can open and broaden the perspectives that these students are going through, and kind of help explain to them these things that they may not understand. So like where Kateri and I are talking about historical trauma, a lot of this trauma is embedded in these students already, but they don't know that that trauma is already there. And so it kind of being able to put words to what they already feel really helps them to understand where they can go from there, because that's a growth and a story that I had to walk with, was learning how to actually shift who I was and the way I talk and the way I talked about myself, to make myself a more Indigenous and identify more with my family and who I was than identify as just who I was in school. And so I think that's the best thing that we can do as Indigenous people anywhere, is just be willing to share our story and show the students that it is okay and it can happen, and things that happen along the way, taking breaks, coming back, that's all natural, and it's things that we can deal with.
Kateri and Shoshaunee, I have one question from the chat. Kateri, if you were going to answer that, I'm really sorry about that. Go ahead, please.
Oh, Shoshaunee answered most of it, right? Like the vast majority of it. The only thing I was going to add was just, to me, more than anything else, it's really just, there are times where I feel like it's really hard to show up in these spaces, in non-native spaces, knowing that you're going to be the minority of the minorities. Like that's just a fact, right? That you're oftentimes going to be 1%, if 1% of the population, if there's enough Indigenous folks in the room to be the 1% of the population. A lot of times you're just the only person who understands your worldview, who understands your lived experience. And one thing I always think of is just like, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the generations that have come behind me. I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors who have been fighting this battle since time immemorial. So it's just constantly reminding myself like why I'm in these spaces and why I put myself on display in a vulnerable space, just to know that like who I'm doing it for. I had no idea I was going to get emotional.
You're not getting emotional, you're feeling the need of the work that we have to do. That's what I always tell myself, because I have that same exact feeling, understanding where we talk about historical trauma, that my great-grandmother wasn't able to receive past the third grade education. And so her wish and fulfillment was that her grandchildren were able to get an education and to continue to do that work. And so for that reason, that is why I'm here. And so I do the same thing that Kateri talks about. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors to do the work for the next generation. So this is an option and opportunity for them.
Thank you. And also when I work when I do work with my youth, more than anything else, there's so limited things that they can control in their life, and the way in which our relationship goes is in their control. If and a lot of times that's a really slow moving process where I honestly don't expect my youth to open up to me in the first 6 months. I expect them to come, get a snack and leave. And I'm cool with that. And I tell them that. And I say, like, thanks for showing up. Thanks for grabbing a snack. Thanks for taking whatever it is that you need and moving on. And it's just that consistency in face, consistency in when they invite me to their recitals or they invite me to their basketball games, I go. Even if it's not during business hours, because them seeing me there, knowing that like I care and it's not during business hours, shows that I'm in it for them and not for a paycheck, because so many of our youth have had that experience where the adults in their life have been here and then left, or they've been here because it's their job and they feel like they're cashing that check. Just thinking about like George's statement earlier or his experience earlier today, how many people he's probably had who he assumed were in it for the paycheck, right? So just being able to be there, allowing them to navigate our relationship in which way they see best. And also technically, when I was working with these previously as an ed specialist, my focus of my job was to make sure my youth were trying to, or giving them to support to have a successful trajectory in high school, right? To graduate high school, which is my overall goal. But to me, in order for them to be successful in high school, they had to know someone was there, whether they're getting the A's or the D's. Just knowing that they're still showing up and means I'm going to keep showing up. And it's okay if I know their pattern. I had some students who I knew when they first came in during fall that they were going to be like in it to win it and they're going to be getting A's and B's. And I knew as soon as around November hit, they're going to get tired and their B's were going to start going to C's. And sometimes their C's are going to start going to D's, and just continuously showing up and saying like, man, I get that test sucked and I get how hard it was for you to show up today. So like, I'm glad you're here and tell me how I can support you to get those grades up. But like, the grades are one thing, but I'm here for you. And eventually those grades will come and eventually their success will come.
Appreciate you both.
Thank you so much, Kateri. The question from the chat is Liliana Godinez says, this workshop was wonderful. Thank you. Is it possible to stay in contact with you for advice or consultation? If yes, what is a good email or phone number?
I will put my email and phone number in the chat. I'm always down to talk about education. I hate to say it. Anybody that has known me, I always thought I was going to go into human services. I thought I was going to be a social worker. And then just like Kateri and I were talking about, for my great-great-grandmother, I couldn't figure out why I kept being pulled back to education, why I kept studying education, and why I want to get my master's in higher ed. And that's the exact reason, because I'm carrying on the work of my Kaya, who I am named after. And so I am totally always down to support people working with Native and Indigenous youth. Absolutely.
I will say this. I am always 100% open to supporting people to support our youth. One question that I get so often that I can't answer in one email is, how do I get a better relationship with my youth? Like, I don't know your youth. I don't know their experience. Do you know their experience? Do you know where their history is coming from? Do you know why they're struggling? Unless you have enough of information about a specific youth or about what it is that you're trying to tackle, that question would be really inauthentic for me to try to answer in one size fits all. Because like, as we go back to my previous one statement that is always right, is it depends, right? So I am always willing to help and to support in any way that I can be, but I don't ever expect like I can answer it in one single email, or that it's something that I can even answer. It might be something that I can help you with, but I can't necessarily answer. I hope you all I didn't like scare you all from asking questions now.
I did also see in the chat that Peggy Carlson mentioned that OSPI is fortunate to have Kateri presenting a more in-depth training, and all are welcome. So if you look in the chat box, you can register for Working in Tribal Communities 101, which will be on November 17th from 9 a.m. to noon. So a little bit longer than we have for this session here.
And I highly encourage, having worked with Kateri, I highly encourage all of you guys, if you do have more kind of like the broad questions of how to work consciously and appropriately with Native youth and Native communities, definitely take Kateri up on our OSPI up on that offer with Kateri. We got to work together to do a very similar webinar for Washington Passport Network. And so it was great to work with her, and she has a lot of great knowledge. So I will definitely give her the praise for that, and definitely encourage you guys to work with that and to take some knowledge and tips from this wonderful woman.
Thank you. I'll just like say kind of briefly on the webinar. So pretty much all my trainings at this point are just like what I would consider like throwing a pebble into a great lake, where you're going to learn something. And I feel like it'll be impactful, but really what you're going to learn is how much you don't really know, in all honesty. Just like any other subject matter that might be new, well, it might not be new. For just like any other subject matter, there'll be a variance of knowledge that some people will be review. For other folks, it'll be brand new knowledge, and for some other folks, it'll be a completely different worldview that you're being exposed to. So it's going to be really varied. It is a 101 training, so it's just going to be like me throwing a pebble into a great lake of what you're trying to understand. So it's a good starting point. That's what I meant.
Any other questions, you all can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or drop it in the chat and I will read it for you. Either way, you're welcome. We have about 5 minutes left scheduled for this session.
You muted yourself, Patrick.
Oh, my bad.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, and sorry for talking a lot. So if anyone else has a question, don't mean to take up too much space. But I think, you know, and my apologies for introducing myself. I work as an academic support coordinator at Western Washington University. And I work with specifically with American Indian, Alaska Native, but also Indigenous identifying students. But so there's this idea too that, you know, we do recognize a lot of students that have come from backgrounds where they may have been disconnected from their culture. But from what I've seen, that not only at tribal college, but also like, you know, Native specific programs at other universities, is there exists this opportunity for like plural knowledges, right? You know, you might meet like where everyone in the room may be missing big pieces of their identity, but all those little pieces coming together can kind of be a way to heal some of the past traumas and to reestablish knowledges. And I think, you know, with this role, those knowledges aren't necessarily relegated also to like Native knowledges, but I think other like knowledges and systems of care, particularly when working with foster youth or homeless youth. But I'm just kind of curious, you know, from your perspectives, you know, what are those bright spots that you may have seen?
Can I ask a little bit more clarification? When you say like bright spots, do you mean what are the bright spots that we've seen working with youth, our own personal bright spots, or can I get
I would say, yeah, like, you know, just things that have been impactful for you as, you know, as human beings, right?
I will say what's been really impactful for me is just seeing the personal growth that I've seen in my youth is unparalleled. It is the reason why I continue in this work. So it's kind of funny. My original plan working at Treehouse is I wanted to work here while I was getting my master's and then go on to becoming a clinical licensed social worker. I'm still here. I love Treehouse, and that's mostly because I love our youth and I see the amount of need and the amount of resilience and the amount of just like beauty that in the youth that we serve. One, I mean, I have so many examples of ways in which my youth have made me proud, but one that really, really stands out to me is I had a youth who I had been working with for, at this point, for about a year and a half. When I first met her, she had a really hard year. She transitioned from going with a foster family that she had been with for like 8 years. And then that family said they were moving. And she then was living with her other siblings, but living in a group home. And this was her 8th grade year. She was well and out. Like, she never went to class. She failed every single one of her classes. She would show up and she was always polite to me, but like there wasn't that real true connection that I was hoping for. Just like we were there, we vibed really well, but I could tell there was something kind of holding her back, right? So fast forward to her freshman year, she was like right on that cusp, right? I could see it that she was either going to continue on this path of, you know, essentially self-destruction because of all the trauma she has experienced, or she could turn it around and just be a true leader in her family and in her community. And I remember how I had an opportunity, or Treehouse had an opportunity to send some of our youth to go speak to the program down in California. And I knew this was going to be like the one push that she really needed. And I was just like, hey, so there's this opportunity that's happening down in California. I want you to speak at it. You're the only person that I am offering this to. Do you want to go? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, the caveat is you have to pass all of your classes and you have to go to school every day. And she turned all of her F's to A's. She went to California. She came back. And then on that trip, I was telling her about canoe journeys, and I was telling her about like how much healing I found as a youth in like really connecting to my cultural background. And we had discussed it, and she's like, I want to go. And I was like, we should go. And she asked, like, will you go with me? And I had my own canoe family, and I said, well, if you go with Muckleshoot, which is her tribe, if you go with Muckleshoot Canoe Family, I will switch over as long as they let me to, and I'll go with you. And she went, and just the amount of growth, and she was one of the hardest pullers on that trip. We made her regalia together, and ever since then, just when she talks about canoe journeys, when she talks about culture, when she talks about her own self as an Indigenous woman, has completely shifted. And now I know that she's going to be successful in whatever it is that she chooses to do. For those, if I want her to go to college, she's thinking about college, but whatever it is that she finds success in, or that she identifies as success, she'll have it. And it took so much time, sorry.
I was gonna say, I can answer mine pretty quick. So my bright spot is actually family. Shockingly enough, working in a college is actually family. I had worked with a student in Running Start from a tribal school, and she was very shy. She was actually the very first person to take on college in her family. She was a foster youth, was living in what we call, it's the Lummi Youth Academy, but it's our group home. It's our transition facility for those that tribal youth that do not have a home. And so she was very unsure about it. And she completed her Running Start. She graduated with being the valedictorian of high school. And she decided to come to college and continued. She graduated with her associate's degree a year later. And through her story and taking care of, she has 4 siblings total. 2 that she was actually able to interact with because they were also in the same, they were taken on by the same family member. And then 2 that she was not able to interact with because they were adopted out. But the youngest, the sister of the twins, decided to do Running Start simply because of her sister doing that. And so I actually have all 3 of these young, wonderful, amazing adults that are doing these things. And I have actually gotten to watch. This student has now decided she is a year away from completing her bachelor's before she's even 21. and she's going to continue to do social work because she wants to continue to work with the foster care system to show youth that it's possible to get out of the place that they're in. And so she is always my bright shining star as well. And then I did see in the chat, and I did answer it, that I have to scroll up a little bit, sorry. That somebody was asking if we could talk about working with students that were taking a break from school and how to help them come back. Absolutely, positively, I will always talk about that. Megan Fitzgerald asked about that. Absolutely, please send me an email. I'd be happy to whether meet with you one-on-one. It's not, just like Kateri always says, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but I can definitely help you with tips and tricks to take care of that student and help bring them back to where they want to be, whatever their goal ends up being.
I do recognize we are over time, so thank you all for staying engaged and for staying here and for listening to our story.
Thank you all so much. We will see you at 1 o'clock for the next round of workshops. And thank you, Kateri and Shoshaunee. Really appreciate it.